It's a dungeon extravaganza. We have a new deep dungeon coming into Final Fantasy XIV Dawntrail in patch 7.3, and you may have missed it because if you blinked you did. In patch 7.4, we're getting a new variant dungeon as well. And you know what time it is? It's time to get cooking in the kitchen with some oil. We got some hot takes off the grill. Prepare for a dungeon-themed episode. Hello everyone. I am Jmulls, and let's get right on into this, shall we?
Before my illness left me bedridden.
Up first we have at Toodles El Nudos 6738, who says, as someone who does a lot of deep dungeons, I'm not enthusiastic for it. Deep dungeons is so repetitive and formulaic in the worst ways possible, even worse with how they continually dilute jobs each expansion. I never want to freaking touch Palace of the Dead with how boring level 50 is for most classes. Stormblood is barely any challenge. Is having a pulse considered a challenge? And one major part of the problem is the complete imbalance in tank immortality. Nothing kills the party casual content than tanks being brain dead mode in all content. Now look, as a tank main, let's slow our roll here, yeah? In fact, what I think tanks need more of is damage and mitigation. I think maybe if Home Gang lasts 5 minutes, has a 2-minute cooldown, and also triples my damage, I think that would be a good direction to go in. Okay, but let's get serious now. I do think there is a bit more to deep dungeons than this comment may indicate, because if you did a lot of deep dungeons, at some point in that process, you probably enjoyed it, unless you were just like going solely for the rewards, in which case, I mean, fair play. But I do think there is something in the system itself, and the concept of a deep dungeon, that is interesting and deserves to be iterated on, and I like pretty much every change they've talked about for the 7.3 deep dungeon. I like the new checkpoints we're getting. I like the fact you can queue for it at all stages. I love the concept of a quantum fight with scalable difficulty and being able to tinker a fight to buff various elements that you choose. I think that's really cool. But personally speaking, deep dungeons is always a system I wanted to get into, but they never really grabbed my attention for long. And I think it was for a couple of reasons, and they're reasons that I hope and do believe this game can address and change going into the future. Maybe not to the 7.3 one, but I think it's a stepping stone. I think for me, when it comes to content like a deep dungeon, I need a lot of variety to the point that I just don't think it's really realistic, and it could just be content that's not necessarily targeted towards me. Because if I do the same thing for long enough, I'm going to get bored of it no matter how good it is. And I don't think, at least the power-ups that I interfaced with in the deep dungeon that I have done in this game, have done enough to really spark my curiosity or my desire to keep replaying that content. I think the deep dungeons have the systems in place, it's just the power-ups themselves could be more varied and interesting. And I think they are leaning in that direction when it comes to the 7.3 deep dungeon. I love the fact one of the things you can just do is summon in Feaul to nuke the floor. That is a really cool idea, especially if you're able to identify a floor that's going to be particularly difficult for you. You can just say, you know what guys, let's bring in the big guns. We need Feaul. Then she comes by, yaps about branches and saplings or something, and just pop-it bombs an entire dungeon. One of the things I wouldn't mind seeing for a deep dungeon at some point is the ability to have a roulette for the deep dungeons, or at least the most recent one, just to give people more of an incentive to run it, because I tried going back, because I largely skipped the deep dungeon we got in Endwalker. I did a little bit of it, but not too much, and a few weeks back, I wanted to go back to do it, and yeah, that queue time, I'm pretty sure was going to last longer than the universe has left before the heat death. And there's no way to kill someone's desire to interface to try out something new than give them a 30 to 60 minute wait time, if not more. They'll just go, you know what, it's not worth the trouble. I'd rather go do anything else than wait around for this to pop. If Final Fantasy XIV can find some way, somehow, to repopulate these deep dungeons, even after the initial drive of people doing them, I think that can go a long way. And I think one of the biggest pieces of feedback we're seeing is just how disappointed and upset people are at the state of job design right now. So content that so heavily revolves around fighting with your job, well, if someone doesn't like the job design in the game, it's going to undercut whatever that content can possibly do. Class/job design is an extremely important element for not only an RPG, but also especially an MMORPG. People want to enjoy pressing their buttons, and you could have a really cool fight, and some people will be able to just enjoy the fight for the fight, but a lot of people are not going to have as good a time as those people if they don't enjoy the buttons they're pressing. And while I do like the changes they made to the Deep Dungeon system going into 7.3, and I like the fact a lot of these changes will apparently happen retroactively for the previous Deep Dungeons as well, just at some point in the future, I think it is fair to say the overall formula for a Deep Dungeon, unless they just didn't talk about a lot of it, doesn't seem to have changed all that much. So if you didn't enjoy Deep Dungeons before, I don't really see the new one doing all that much unless your big pain points were just the specific things they changed and addressed, like new checkpoints and being able to have a matched party above floor 30. For me, I kind of resigned myself to the idea that I think Dawntrail will continue to get better with each patch, and I think they're going to make pretty cool changes with each of the patches when it comes to these pieces of content, but I'm not expecting anything completely game-changing, and I was pleasantly surprised to be kind of wrong on that when they talked about Quantum Mode. That was the type of change I wouldn't expect until 8.0, but if that is a sign of things to come, and it's just Square Enix pretty much saying, look, we get the feedback, we understand, we're hearing it, it's just we need time. I'm not as pessimistic as some other people where they will say, oh, when we get to 8.0, nothing's gonna be different, everything's going to be the exact same. I'm not of that opinion. I do think it will largely still be Final Fantasy XIV, right? They're not gonna completely change the entire game or anything like that. It's still going to be Final Fantasy XIV. But if they alter their design philosophy on various elements of the game, like they're showcasing and they talked about in the 7.3 Live Letter Part 2, with having more content that tries to appeal to every demographic of player, whether that be casual, midcore, or hardcore, while still having content designed for either end of that spectrum, I think that is a good direction to take for the game. It's just you have to be really careful about designing content that ends up pleasing nobody because you're attempting not to upset anybody, which in my opinion has been the design philosophy most hazardous to this game for the longest time. But yeah, for the Deep Dungeon, I'm looking forward to it. I want to put some time into this one. Of all the Deep Dungeons, this one interests me the most, and I'll get out of it what I can. So let's move on to the next take.
Before my illness left me bedridden.
Next up, we have at Shane H6707, who says, my hot take is that improving and overhauling a lot of the game's core systems that are outdated should take precedence over any nebulous job identity issues that exist. They do exist, I'm not saying they don't. People just can't seem to explain what that means or even agree on what it means. There are so many things on the quality of life side of the game that are severely outdated, being held back by bad code, like the friends list being the worst I've ever seen in any online game. Why can't I remove more than one person? Why does it take 20 seconds for it to refresh? Why is it not client side, but the blacklist is? Why does it not remove me from someone's friends list when I remove them from mine? Party Finder is janky as hell. If someone leaves my PF, I have to pull it down, clear their spot, and put it back up. Another system in need of an overhaul. So many systems that would improve the general experience of the game, especially for newbies, if they were improved upon. Also, workshops should not be tied to housing and be through your GC. This would go a long way to improving the housing situation, as it would eliminate shell FCs taking up plots that someone can actually be using instead of just empty houses. Now, I do think this take has a point to it, and it's issues like this that I do believe need to be addressed in the future. However, I disagree with them being more important than core functionality of the game, such as job design or pieces of content, because I think for the longest time, Final Fantasy XIV has had issues like this, and a lot of people cared, but they didn't care that much because the game itself was still super enjoyable to them, and they were fully engaged with the product. And that can happen where you can have a bunch of little issues with a game, but you can still really enjoy the game so long as they get the really important stuff right. Gameplay, story, the feel of it. And I think for a lot of people, Final Fantasy XIV hit that mark. And for one reason or another, a lot of that has been eroded away with Dawntrail, or you can even argue the patches of Endwalker, or depending upon the person, even older than that. I do agree that it's issues like this that should be addressed at some point in the future, and I can understand that for Final Fantasy XIV specifically, because of the bad code, it can be really complicated and difficult to actually implement changes to those systems. I get that, but I don't think that's a reason not to do it at some point. It's like adding chat bubbles into the game baseline, I think is a good change. Is it going to completely reinvent someone's experience with Final Fantasy XIV? Probably not, but just because it's not going to really save the game for a lot of people, I don't think that's a good reason to not have them. I think multiple things can and should be done at the same time, and I do think that is what Final Fantasy XIV is trying to do. But they can talk about things needing time all they want. For most consumers out there, they're not going to care. They want a good game now. They're paying for the game right now. They want a good game right now. I think one of the best things that Square Enix can possibly do is when we get to FanFest season and they go into the new cycle for 8.0, to really dig into these issues and to talk about what changes they're making, if any, to a lot of these systems, like job design or the overall content cadence. I think they're starting to do that already. Again, with the Deep Dungeon in 7.3, they really talked about that change in philosophy they want to have for the game moving forward, and I do think it can be a healthy one. I like a lot of the changes we're seeing. It's just, that's not enough for a lot of people. I would push back a little bit on people's complaints about job design and identity being a bit nebulous. I feel a lot of people have spoken up about the 2-minute meta and how homogenized a lot of the jobs feel to play. I mean, heck, for my tanks, a lot of my keybinds are just based on the same archetype of ability. So when I tried out a new tank for the first time, I would just read and be like, oh, that's like this other ability, I'll just put it on this hotbar and on this hotkey. I think an element to game design a lot of people can just kind of ignore, or they don't pay attention to, is the RPG part of the MMORPG. And that RPG being a role-playing game. People like to play a role. People want to immerse themselves not only in their Warrior of Light, but who their Warrior of Light is. Whether that be a Paladin, or a Dark Knight, or a Dragoon, or a Viper, or a White Mage, or a Black Mage, or a Red Mage, or a Blue Mage. People like taking on the role of their job in that virtual world. And part of being able to feel that role and to play that role is how that role actually plays. And I'm not just talking about tank, healer, DPS. I'm talking about the individual feeling of being that job. And if you start to play a bunch of different jobs and you realize, you know what, these are starting to feel kind of samey to me. It erodes that illusion and refocuses the eyes and pulls the head back. We've talked about this before, but like, it is a hard thing to strike perfectly. Because if you have a bunch of variants in job design, extreme outliers will be decried about because, oh, they're not viable or they're just not as useful as someone else. So in response to that feedback, they're brought more in line with everyone else, and that's a cycle that just completely removes a lot of identity from how jobs and classes can play and feel, until we get to where we're at right now, or even past this point as well, where people are like, oh my god, can we please get something different here? And then you start to go the other way, until eventually you hit that wall again, and people say, you know what, hey, these are a bit too different, there's no real reason to use this job over this one, having all of these things not lining up with each other doesn't feel particularly good when it comes to a raid environment. Can we bring them back into some kind of normalcy here, and then it goes all the way back to where we are right now, and it's a pendulum that just keeps swinging back and forth. And like, finding that perfect middle ground is really hard because that perfect middle ground is different for like each individual. And when you have a game that is as big as Final Fantasy XIV or other MMORPGs of this size, you're going to have a lot of people with different opinions that want different things out of a game, that want different things out of the game than you, than me, than anyone else. That stems not just in terms of the content they do, but how the job itself plays. Now, that doesn't mean you can't do anything right or wrong. There will be some changes in some overall archetypes that gravitate more people to them than others. The main point I'm trying to drive home here is that it can be really hard to find that good middle ground. And I think part of the process in finding it is being willing to upset a few people. I'm personally not going to be someone that says, oh, we're not going to see like any substantial job changes in 8.0, and I'm not going to be the type of guy that says, oh, we're going to see complete revisions in 8.0. I'm going to wait until they actually talk about it, until we see what the changes actually are, and then we can talk about that. I will say right now, I'm not overly fond of pressing my buttons in Final Fantasy XIV. I do think we need some substantial job revisions across the board, largely speaking. I went tank because it was the one role I really still enjoyed to some degree, and even then I have my issues with it. I miss unique mechanics. I miss things that did more than just increase the number on my screen. But again, there's no easy answer here. Time will tell.
Before my illness left me bedridden.
For the final take of the video, we have at Asin24, who says, variant dungeons being the normal for dungeons, but instead of picking your path, instead the dungeons end up randomly selecting different paths each run. It's understandable that it's going to lead to likely some bosses being the same in each path. But even if it tosses the occasional different boss, even if it's the final boss, with the mechanics of the others changing a little depending on the route, it would be a nice change of pace. I think that really does sound cool, and I like the overall idea. My fear is that it would also require them to pump out more content, because I doubt they would replace a traditional dungeon with an entire variant dungeon. I have to imagine a variant dungeon requires more work than a traditional 3-boss dungeon. And my bigger fear is that the variant dungeon system wouldn't completely address the main qualm I have with dungeon design in Final Fantasy XIV, that being the layout and the playstyle outside of bosses feeling so samey and cookie cutter. I like variant dungeons as a concept. I'm glad they're bringing them back in 7.4. I want to see how they change that core idea and system, similar to what they're doing with deep dungeons. I would love to see and find out what they're cooking up for that. When it comes to regular dungeons though, I think we can and probably should have both. It's just I want more layout variety. I want more interesting things that we do inside the dungeons. I think for too long the major problem with dungeon design has been they feel like they fulfill a quota instead of introducing a really fun and compelling gameplay scenario for the player. But I will say in Dawntrail I've quite liked the dungeon bosses. Those have been a highlight for me and I've really enjoyed them. It's just everything between those bosses I don't think should just be so cookie cutter and hyper repetitive. But I do really like the idea of when you interface with a dungeon and you go into a dungeon, sometimes there can be a little bit of variance there. I think that would be a really cool thing to have. Like taking some elements of a variant dungeon and implementing them into regular dungeons. I think one of the biggest disappointing elements of dungeon design in Final Fantasy XIV for me is just how cool and impressive the environments in a lot of these dungeons actually are when you look at them. Especially like the one we got in 7.2, right? Like that place was gorgeous. And it looked so expansive and I could just feel my disappointment rise the moment it clocked in my brain. It's like, oh yeah, it's a dungeon. We have like one corridor here. I want to be able to go off the beaten path and to explore these locations. Give me various objectives that we could fulfill. Make them non-linear. Sure, in terms of an overall content package, it makes sense to view a dungeon as a quota to be filled, but I think that can wear away at the overall soul of what this content can be. It's like if you go on vacation to a new destination that you've never been to before, and yeah, it's cool being there, but if you're only locked to one road for your entire time there, it can be a bit disappointing. You want to go off the beaten path. You want a journey to see what you can do in these various locations and corners. And honestly, I would be an advocate for the idea that I wouldn't mind not having a dungeon with every patch, so long as the dungeons that we ended up getting were more fleshed out and content rich. Maybe I speak for myself on that one, entirely possibly so, right? And you can absolutely disagree with me on that, but I wouldn't mind getting less dungeons if it meant each dungeon we actually got was better or cooler. I would prefer just getting more, but if that's not realistic for whatever reason, I would advise Square Enix to give the Final Fantasy XIV team more resources so we don't have that excuse. But if we're working within the confines of what they can do, I would say I wouldn't mind not having a dungeon with every patch if it made the dungeons we ended up getting far more fulfilling and cool. Just my 2 cents.
Before my illness illness left me bedridden.
But the hot takes never stop, people. They can't stop. The train has no brakes. For 7.3, the new patch for Final Fantasy XIV comes out in just a few days. So here's where you come in. Leave a comment down below with your thoughts, your opinions going into patch 7.3 for the main story. I want to hear your theories, your thoughts, what's going to happen, your predictions, your theories for what happens in patch 7.3 specifically. And in a future video, after I've played the MSQ, we'll look back on them and see how accurate you guys truly are. And while you're down there, leave a like and subscribe so you can be up to date with everything Final Fantasy XIV related as we head into patch 7.3 and beyond. I have a TikTok, Twitch, and Twitter, Jmulls G. I have a Discord in the description down below. Come and hang out with all the jabronis there. And guys, they updated the patch 7.3 website not too long ago. And if you want to find out what's going on with patch 7.3, you should check out this video right here. Stay safe, everybody. Have a great day, and I'll see you all next time. Bye-bye, everybody, until we meet again!